Our session is titled It's a Relay Marathon, Not a Solo Sprint. And we're going to talk to you about post-implementation. We're going to give our firsthand experience from UGA Law Library, including some tips and tricks that we've used to move forward with OpenAthens. It's been a long road, and we're working with a lot of electronic resources. I'm going to introduce us as well. I'm Rachel Evans, Metadata Services and Special Collections Librarian at UGA Law Library. And my supervisor and close colleague, Wendy Moore, is here as well. She's our Associate Director of Collection Services, and she's going to give you a lot of information about managing the vendor side of this. And we also have with us Ken Hensley, Galileo Support Analyst. We've gotten to know Ken really well. We've sent him a lot of emails in the past couple years, so thank you for being here with us, Ken. And of course, Russell Palmer. Many of you may recognize him as Assistant Director of Galileo and the OpenAthens Support Services. And now I'm going to turn it over to Russell to give us a background of everything we're going to talk about today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. We're going to start out today by talking a little bit about the background from Galileo's perspective and just a summary of where we started with this. We'll talk about the law library's backstory with OpenAthens and how we've been working with them. We'll talk about some mid-implementation stories. We'll have some good conversation and back and forth, sort of panel style here for you about some of the things that we encountered, challenges mid-implementation. We'll talk about what we've been doing since the implementation was completed, both on the Galileo and UGA law side. And then we'll offer up some practical tips and resources along the way, and a wrap up with some Q&A and information about how to get in touch with us if you're interested in learning more. So let's start out with a little bit of background on Galileo and OpenAthens. So way back in 2017, Galileo went through a massive strategic planning process. We wanted to hear from as many librarians as we could in the Galileo community. We wanted to hear from Galileo users. We did a lot of outreach during this time. We had a lot of meetings. We worked with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government to work through this planning process, and they were very helpful at facilitating that. And one of the charges that came out of the strategic planning process was to make authentication as easy as possible. So we began to review single sign-on solutions. So we spent 27 and 18 really looking closely at what was out there in the landscape, and we spent a lot of time on OpenAthens, reviewing it, vetting it, planning for the pilot implementations ultimately once we made a decision to go with that product. And OpenAthens is out there on the bleeding edge of library technology. It is really designed to make things easier for libraries, but it takes some time and some heavy lifting to get there. So we began implementations in earnest in December of 2018. Our first institution to go live is one of interest to this conversation because it was Agnes Scott. And Agnes Scott was also eager to move away from the WAM proxy, which the law school was using. Before we dig in too deep, I want to just present a little bit of authentication terminology for you, just so that if we start slinging around different authentication ideas and concepts, that you'll have a better understanding of what we're talking about. And I'll run through this quickly. Basically, a proxy is something you'll hear us talk a lot about. And again, anybody who has any true technical skill will call me out on the flaws with these definitions. But I'm going to give you some layperson definitions of these terms so that you can just kind of follow along. But a proxy is basically a means for a user to log in. They can log in a variety of different ways: single sign-on, a single password, and they log in using being affiliated with a vendor-recognized IP address. So it makes it look like you're coming from a campus, basically, when you're not. A federation. You hear us talk about federations and federated access, and it sounds really complicated, and it is, but if I break it down to its essence, a federation is basically a thing you join, and you join by adopting trusted standards, basically, for single sign-on. And federated access means you're accessing via federated standard, like SAML, which I'll talk about in a minute, not via an IP address or a proxy. So a SAML is a term you hear a lot of IT folks tossing around, and SAML is a very complex concept, but in the bottom line of SAML is it's a trusted standard sign-on language. It's a markup language designed to support single sign-on. So there are a lot of different flavors of SAML that you'll hear about. You'll hear people talk about Shibboleth and CAS, and also OpenAthens is a kind of SAML single sign-on. Finally, you'll hear us toss around the term identity provider or IDP. And this is just the store of local data used to facilitate authentication. It's what your IT staff keep up. That's just basically the data about students, faculty, and staff at academic institutions or patrons at public libraries that's used for authentication. And there are lots of different flavors of identity providers too. You hear us toss around terms like IDP or Azure or Active Directory or ADFS or Glue, and even the library catalog in the case of public libraries. And then briefly for the law library was a source of authentication information. So a lot of different names and things that we call an IDP. And finally, attribute. The attribute concept is pretty simple, but it can be pretty complicated. And we'll see more of that later with the law library's implementation. An attribute is basically a piece of information that comes from that identity provider about a library user. So we want to be very sensitive to things like privacy when we talk about attributes. But at the same time, attributes can be helpful to us when we know something about a student. It's that we need an attribute to authenticate against the vendor's account. But we also need attributes to let vendors know who we are. So for an example that we'll talk about here in some detail, is we needed to be able to tell the difference between library users at UGA who were coming from the law school, who were affiliated with the law school, and those who were coming from the UGA main campus library. So that, again, in a nutshell, is the concept of some authentication terminology. So let's talk a little bit about just quickly, what is OpenAthens? OpenAthens essentially is a hosted middleware. We joke around the Galileo offices that it's SAML in a box. It's basically an authentication system wrapped up in a nice, tidy package. It's used to manage the authentication transaction between the user who runs through the local identity provider, who's identified by that local identity provider, and library content provider, so the vendor. So that transaction comes through OpenAthens, picks up the information it needs, sends it to the vendor, and then the vendor sends back the authorization and lets the user in. And how is that different than easy proxy or a WAM transaction? It does not rely fully and completely on IP authentication, although it still does somewhat. It uses a redirector in some, but not all cases, for links. And a redirector, for those of you who are familiar with using proxies, it's very similar to a proxy prefix. It sends the user to a local login page instead of sending them to a proxy login page, for example, or automatically letting them in. So that's just a quick overview of what some of the authentication terminology that we'll be using, and just a quick look at what is OpenAthens.
Just to give you a little more background about the law library, we are a standalone library at the University of Georgia, and we are not affiliated in any way with university libraries on our campus. And as mentioned, we operate our own ILS, which we use Innovative Sierra, and our authentication system that we were using was Innovative's WAM, which is similar to Easy Proxy. As I always say, Easy Proxy, but without all the nice updates. So we have never been a part of GIL, and nor do we have our own Galileo platform. We have always just used Galileo resources through our university libraries. So we had this legacy way of authenticating users to resources, and it was becoming increasingly problematic due to campus security upgrades, changing security protocols on the internet, as well as just evolving resource platform delivery. So the way vendors were delivering resources to us were no longer able to kind of really use the WAM aspects to carry tokens through and keep our users logged in. So we really needed a new solution, and we needed it fast. And that was in October of 2017. So October 2017, we have no idea that Galileo is interested in any of this. We are operating, like I said, completely on our own. We have a demo with OpenAthens and EBSCO, and we love it. We're like, maybe this is the solution we're looking for. We are on board. We're like, we're going to move to this in the next calendar year. And that winter, so we're kind of talking back and forth with EBSCO, and that winter EBSCO contacted me and was like, just to kind of let you know, we're negotiating a consortium-wide deal with Galileo, and you're in Georgia, right? So you should just be part of that. Like, you don't need to, like, we need to just like stop this right now, and you can just be part of this other deal. And we were like, can we? I don't know. That's not, we've never been invited to be part of anything before. I don't even know that they know we exist. But we asked, and Galileo was like, oh, sure, law library, why not? And so in March of 2018, we were green-lighted to participate. And it was during that spring and summer that Russell and I first got to know each other. We started exchanging emails. We had, several phone calls that were kind of part of the pre-implementation meetings. And as Russell already mentioned, there was a lot of parallels with us with both with Agnes Scott, but also Georgia State also has a law library. And so, it seemed like it would be pretty easy to slot us in, and that it wouldn't be a big heavy lift. And then July 2019, lots of the USG libraries have already been implemented, but it was decided that UGA would go last because there's a lot of complexity of some resources, and UGA needed more time to prepare things. So, we were getting all of our resources together. We were ready for implementation. And in December of 2019, we have a kickoff meeting with OpenAthens. We're going to go live in January 2020. And at the top of my notes for that meeting, somebody, was it Russell? I don't know. Was it someone from OpenAthens? I have no idea. But they said, this could change. And that was a complete understatement. The solution that OpenAthens brought for our two separate libraries on the same campus to that meeting was rejected. And university libraries felt like there had to be a better solution out there. And so we had to go completely back to the drawing board. Then you all know what happened. There was a pandemic. And so that slowed us down considerably. But we did finally actually go live on December 21st in 2020. But what happened though was that meant the law library was actually under a lot of pressure to get the bulk of our resources moved to OpenAthens, because our WAM authentication was going to sunset itself because we were actually moving our server to a new IP range. And so that was, in order to continue using WAM, we were going to have to do as much, if not more work than what we were already putting into moving to OpenAthens. So the time was really ticking for us to do a lot of work really fast. And the delays had kind of caught up and had made that a really intense spring. And then we moved on, and by July 2021, we were feeling a lot better. We did a lot of review as to where we were at. But then as the school year started that fall, we really did start to discover some weak points in how the authentication was set up campus-wide. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we resolved and are continuing to resolve some of those things. So we, as I mentioned, we had zero relationship with Galileo prior to OpenAthens. And at the start of this process, I didn't realize how much Galileo would become our partner in this process. We just needed a better authentication system. But Galileo has actually became a really strong ally for us, who gave a lot of weight to our needs, and in a way that, as a library who's always been kind of on the outside of this process of, not being in GIL, not really being in Galileo, really made us feel like we belonged, which means a lot to me still to this day, and really pushed for solutions with our colleagues at university libraries and with the UGA campus IT people that we couldn't have achieved on our own. And So it was great to have Galileo and the people who work there in our corner. Now, was this a completely smooth process? Were there a couple of times I sent some terse emails like, were you meeting without us? Why didn't you email me? But I think by the time we got to the point of implementation in December of 2020, we had all really learned to trust each other. And I think as much as we learned the value of what Galileo brought to the table, I think Galileo also learned that the law library, while we were small, we were sort of mighty and brought a lot of willingness and creativity to problem solving some of these access issues and finding things that really works for all of our users on cross campus. Let's talk about some of those technical things. Like I said, there was a lot of problem solving and we needed a lot of creative solutions. This issue that had come up with university libraries rejecting the initial plan that OpenAthens had set up for us to have the two different instances of two libraries, two different kind of user groups, but that overlap all on the same campus. That got rejected because there were just too many steps from the end user's point of view. And so we needed a technical solution that could seamlessly identify UGA law school users separately from other users at UGA who were non-law school. And we had been told here at the law school for years, this can never happen. Don't even ask. Our law school IT people were like, that's too big an ask. We can't even ask that. And then we had some friends at Galileo who did ask. So I'll let Ken and Russell talk a little bit more about what happened then.
First of all, just for context, this is Sad Bulldog. Sad Bulldog lives at my house, and Sad Bulldog gets mad when he can't authenticate into Oxford or other important resources, or when Georgia loses. So we've had Sad Bulldog for a long time. They're issued in our neighborhood. In any case, finding a way to recognize those law students, faculty, and staff is going to be done via an attribute. And so we need to be able to tell law users apart from UGA main campus users, but we also needed to be able to count UGA law users as main campus users because they have access to everything available through the main library. It sounds pretty simple, but it gets pretty complex when it comes to authentication. So we worked with, and I have to give, this is where I give credit to Sean Purcell. As some of you know, we have staff at both UGA and out at the DB300 building. We have Galileo staff and we have UGA staff who work on behalf of Galileo. It's complicated, but Sean is one of our UGA system staff, as is Kevin Cottrell and Barry Robinson, who all worked very closely with us in communicating with the EITS group at UGA about this. So what we did is we worked with them to set up a meeting and a discussion about our needs specifically. And when we better defined our needs, and I think that's a good, we talked about tips and tricks, is better defining your needs for IT is always a challenge. And sometimes I think picking up that phone and making a call and showing them what you're trying to achieve and showing them that the systems you're using are adequate to protect the privacy of users is very important. So I think that was a big stride. Meeting with EITS and talking with them about what we needed to do was very helpful. So we were able to come out of the other side of that with something of a solution. Basically worked with the EITS and they added the law affiliated users to an Active Directory group. So they are recognized in that group, but they don't necessarily have to pass a giant wide open attribute that tells everyone on the other side of that transaction that they are a law student. So it better protects the user privacy, but also passes the information needed from the Active Directory in order to differentiate those patrons. So that, as said, was easier said than done, but we got there. And again, that was, as was pointed out, was a months-long effort with continuing conversations and coordinating with UGA, EITS, law school IT, and the libraries. But we managed to make that happen. And Ken, please feel free to add anything there that you would like.
Sure. I guess the next thing we were faced with is just how to control access to resources for these two different groups. We have the option of using permission sets in OpenAthens. This is where resources for multiple user groups are controlled within OpenAthens rather than at the vendor. With this arrangement, main and law users are under a single entity ID and scope that is registered at the vendor. And then in the OpenAthens admin, a permission set is created to represent each user group. And when a resource is allocated in the admin, you can assign the resource to the entitled group. And so it all happens before the user ever gets to the vendor platform. The arrangement that we went with is having a separate scope for law users, in addition to main having its own scope. So for resources that are licensed for the entire campus, which is mostly main's resources, but I guess law also has campus-wide resources. Both main and law's OpenAthens scope would need to be registered with the vendor. And like we mentioned before, OpenAthens has a proxied service, so the IP associated with that, we had a separate IP for law and main, and those both need to be registered for campus-wide resources. So for resources that are only licensed for law, only the scope would be registered and the law proxy IP would be registered. And so when new resources are acquired, basically we have to remember to register both law and main's OpenAthens information. One problem that we face with this is it's not necessarily unique to OpenAthens, and that's when two different user groups within an institution have unique access rights to a resource on the same platform under one vendor account. So if there was a resource that needed to be restricted to just law users and was on a platform for a vendor that the main library had purchased content for all of UGA, then there isn't really a way to restrict access to just law users. The way around this was to create another vendor count. We try to avoid this as much as possible because if law users are authenticating into a separate account from main users and there is campus-wide content that law users have access to from that platform, then UGA staff and vendors will have to, remember to keep these two accounts in sync with both content, campus-wide content. So for an institution that has 800 plus resources, this is really hard to keep up with. And fortunately, this was fairly uncommon. Initially, we had a situation with EBSCO where law had purchased a couple of law-specific databases and EBSCO agreed to make those campus-wide. So for EBSCO, we just have one account with two scopes registered. Another problem we ran into with federated vendors is that they can't handle two scopes. In this case, we had to create a separate account. Luckily, this didn't happen often, but we did run into this with Oxford. Since both main and law purchase a lot of content from Oxford, we decided it would be impossible to keep up with both counts, trying to keep those in sync. So we decided just to point all users to main's account. And the way we handled the scope situation is we decided that law users would actually be proxied into Oxford. So we just had the law proxy IP registered with Oxford, and all the links that we're using for law on their databases A to Z is going through the OpenAthens proxy. We actually had to prepend those URLs with the OpenAthens proxy rather than the redirector, because the redirector would default to the federated access. So we did have to make special arrangements for that. For a smaller institution, this, having two accounts might be more manageable, but for UGA, it was something we wanted to avoid. And lastly, the arrangement with Oxford, it wasn't sorted out in a few days or a week. It took several weeks for this to basically, to be decided on what we ended up going with. Unfortunately, with a lot of federated vendors, staff knowledge of how their products support OpenAthens is fairly low. So you can't really assume that the person that you're corresponding with understands your needs or the arrangement. It might require some meetings, and you might have to be painfully detailed in your description of what you're asking. And so I guess I'll let Wendy talk more about that if she would like.
Yeah, I think exactly what Ken was saying, that it having to be very clear and make the right ask is really is one of the hardest parts, and communication is the real challenge. And I think that in as you mentioned, we found some holes by the fall of 2021 where it seemed like things were working, but then we realized things weren't actually working, right? And one of these areas did involve some Oxford products, and it was complicated. Both university libraries and the law library have a lot of Oxford subscriptions. They're campus-wide access, but they're being paid for and managed by different groups. And this was actually causing the law library to actually get shut out of our own content, because it was like the separate Active Directory of law users was actually keeping us out of the resources instead of letting us in. And further complicating this is that Oxford, we have products on this university has products from Oxford on, I think at this time, at least 6 or 7 different platforms, right? So it's not like we had one problem on one platform. We had to have fixes on all these different platforms, which was an issue for Oxford as well, right? But the real key was just finding the right people to talk to and to explain the specific issues that we were having so that solutions could be found. And that really was the challenge. Sometimes there would be bottlenecks where, what really needed to happen was some tech people in OpenAthens to be able to talk to some tech people in Oxford. But in order for that to happen, that had to funnel through Galileo and to us and to university libraries. And then all that funneled to one person at Oxford, who was our rep. And then she had to send all that then back up the chain through Oxford's end. And so just like in a good old fashioned game of telephone, things could get really muddled and really confused pretty easily.
And transitioning here, Wendy, to Oxford's credit, that rep, her telephone number, her cell phone number is now in my contacts.
Yes, most definitely. I don't want that to even seem negative. I think
right.
It's just,
no, not
it
at
just
all.
is it really does speak to how that you're not just the customer and somebody's not just the vendor. We actually all kind of have to work together on these things. And sometimes there is, I think even going back and speaking about the attribute issue we had here at UGA, I remember the people from OpenAthens and EBSCO kept saying, what do you mean, UGA, that you don't know the different, you don't know where your users are? How do you not know law users? How do you not know, don't you need to know who's in what school? And UGA was like, no, that's not how we operate. And so it was interesting because these other vendors had some assumptions that all universities would have all of their students and staff and faculty all tagged as being, affiliated with a particular school or department. And that's just not how things work. And so we had to do a lot of communicating. And by we, I mean, Russell and Ken had to do a lot of communicating back to the people at EBSCO and at OA to say, no, that's not how this works. And then we, had to turn and like you said, the folks at university libraries as well as Galileo really worked hard with campus IT then to explain okay, there's got to be something. And so the communication is just, we're all the vendor and we're all the customer at a certain point, right? So, okay, I'll stop talking.
No, it's all absolutely true, Wendy, and it's great. Our vendors, we try to view them as partners, and certainly EBSCO and OpenAthens have been great partners with this, but at the same time, there are always those challenges of communication and clarification that we need to work through. And just some other things, and this is more of a recap, I think, of what Ken and Wendy have already alluded to. Vendors need to be able to differentiate too. One of the challenges that Ken mentioned, and it's an ongoing challenge for us, is when we have situations like this, and we have situations like this with public libraries as well, where we have public library systems that have branches, and the branches have legacy content that they license that isn't available to the entire library system. So we need to be able to do that type of thing with vendors there. And we're working on some challenges with that right now, actually, and we need to get those solved before we can do our K-12 implementation. Wendy, I think you have been incredibly patient with us while we've taken so much time to do this. But and this is not being defensive at all, but part of what takes time is you see what's over on the left-hand side of the screen. When you see this as a user, you become completely alienated. We have to make sure things are working as well as possible with our institutions when we bring them live, so that we can, the law school and Maine are an exception. We've gotten a lot of work done toward perfecting this at this point, but things do go wrong. And when authentication goes wrong, it's the most awful possible scenario, because students, faculty, and staff cannot get access to the content they need. But we do continue to work on multiple scope issues and getting those things set up on the vendor side. As Ken mentioned, IT support isn't always as adept at knowing what's going on. I feel like at times we are educating vendors. I know Ken has taken the time very patiently to explain to vendors on calls, as has Mike and myself, what's going on, how this is working. There's a lot of mythos around OpenAthens that it won't work with all resources. If you can proxy it, you can Athenize it pretty much at this point. But there's a whole culture and vendors to say we don't use OpenAthens. Well, they do, they just don't know it. And it hasn't filtered down in the right ways down to the vendor IT and the vendor support staff. So we're constantly working to improve those working relationships with our vendors that support. We have vendors that support federated single sign-off authentication very well. We have those that are still learning and still struggling. So that summarizes, I think, the general vendor challenges pretty well. And you guys have gotten into some of the details of that also. So can we move on?
All right, I think I'm going to take the reins here for a minute. If you are like me and you're the librarian who's just making the task level changes, that's really been my role in all of this, having to coordinate with Wendy when a resource is ready to go, and then actually making those changes in our A to Z list or in our catalog. And when those don't work and I'm having to troubleshoot it, that's when I have to reach out. And I've gotten to know Ken very well in sending him emails about this resource isn't working. I've tried this and this version of a link. What do I do now? And so that's really been my interaction with these folks, and working through that for the law library. That Wendy and I got together with our other member of the systems team, and we sat down and started mapping out, okay, this is really happening now. And this is when we were originally planning to launch in January of 2020. And we said, well, what do we need to do to know that this is working? We knew there was not a lot of great access for our resources at that point, particularly off campus. And this is right before the pandemic takes off. So we had no idea how much more valuable extended off-campus access was about to become to our users. So July to December 2019, I literally went through all of our resources. I had sort of a master spreadsheet, and I remember printing that out and walking downtown so that I could get off of UGA's IP and I could completely get off of even UGA's wireless. And I tested every single resource we had so that we could establish a baseline of, were users getting access to it right now? If they were, how many clicks did it take? And what were they seeing? What was that experience for every single resource? So that we could know, as we continued to transition to OpenAthens and all of this continued to take place as it had, what was the improvement for our users? We wanted to be able to measure that. This is the screen, as you see here, that our users saw more than any other screen in December of 2019. The majority of our resources showed this. It was about 60% of our resources that you had to click through this at least twice. Some of them, you had to hit this about 10 times to get to the resource. As Wendy and Ken and Russell have already talked about, we had sort of a false start with the way that things were going to work between our resources and Maine libraries. So we did not launch in January of 2020, but it did buy us a little bit more time to make sort of a slower rollout, and I was able to continue testing. We turned around and we set up our own Trello board that now Wendy, myself, myself and our colleague Jason, our systems team still shares it, and it still serves as our home base. So that would be my takeaway number one. If you're on the side of doing this in your library, no matter what phase you're at, that has been a really great resource to be able to create a card for every single item. And even as things continue and we get new resources, so that we can drag it across, we can test it, we can make sure it's working in all the different places, and we can kind of monitor that and track that. So here on the screen, you can see the top left. That was a Google Sheet that we linked to from our Trello board so that we could get access as a group and sort of time out, like, we've tested this one, it's working, or if we tested it and it was working, but not quite right. And eventually, as we transitioned it, things moved across the board and they continue to. So phase one of that was really after we had the planning, we were updating the smallest set of resources we can think of, which was like our website, our most frequently used resources. It was the quickest and easiest box to check because they were all links that we could just go through. So updating those web resource links, that was sort of our phase one. Phase two, this was kind of in two parts. We updated our A to Z list, which is just under 100 database links. And that was another pretty achievable goal. That's a key area where users are finding our resources. We actively send our users to our A to Z list in our LibGuides. And so that was a good place to start transitioning those resources. And actually, Galileo and OpenAthens had some great documentation on how to do that with LibGuides as a whole and those resource sets. And then sort of the second part of that phase two was updating our collection level MARC record links. And those were really like the title of the resource. If you searched for a database in our library catalog, what's that sort of master level where you would get to that resource page? And so those MARC records were almost a one-for-one for the A to Z database list. And those two sets, that went along pretty well, and we were able to update those. So that was sort of completing phase two. And now we're on to phase three, catalog records for item level, title level, and some series level collections that our databases, sure, the primary database link has been Athenized and is working great, but there are sometimes hundreds and tens of thousands of related individual resource links that we're still working through. So here you can see a screenshot of a spreadsheet where I had sort of the title, and I've got the new Athenized links, and there's been old links. And some of these sets of links I've been able to do in different sets of batches. So I'm not having to do them individually, but even with the same provider, and Oxford is another example of this, even within the same provider and the same database, the links may be different. And this relates to what Wendy was talking about with there being different platforms, even with the same vendor, those links are going to be formatted differently. And so you can't just completely batch, 1,000 links. You really need to do it piece by piece, because every so often there's a link that is different, and there may be a set of links that are different. And so you have to work with those very carefully. Here is a larger set. So this is actually an example of some links that I worked with Ken to get. I said, Ken, hey, I got some really ugly links here. They're taking me a lot of time, and there's no way I can do these individually. Can you send me a larger set and in a spreadsheet? And I would send him a batch of links, and he'd send me back some. And I was able to really work with those so that I could do some larger batches. So this example here is from Oxford Bibliography, and it's got some of their URLs that moved from the old ones to Athenized ones. And then I could actually use our global update tool in Sierra so that I could do larger sets of links at a time. And so now the work, it continues. I think my first slide said item level MARC records, and the second one was more, and now we're at even more, and it feels like it'll never end. But we are sort of on the other side of this implementation. Here's a screenshot to the left of Sierra's global update function so that you can see what the results look like. This is a batch of 993 records that I was about to process. And then on the far right, you can see the results. I usually get a nice result summary, and it'll tell me how many changed.
I wanted to kind of like just quickly summarize where we're at. I mean, as Rachel just said, so many MARC records, right? And it is complicated. We've had a lot of issues where the IP access to resources on campus have given us some false positives for authentication, where we think we're authenticating, but we're not. I mean, we're just using the IP address. And so those have been hard to track. And like Rachel said, it's required us to do a lot of checking of resources off campus and doing some of that work not here. And then just like something as simple as keeping this special Active Directory, we have to keep that up to date. Cool IT guy's like, hey, did you update the Active Directory? And he'll be like, oh yeah, I'll do that. And once again, it can be a little challenging because there is sometimes some of these things that are so important. But it does take that one person doing that one thing to make it all work. And they don't always even know how important they are to the process.
I'm really glad that I'm able to batch some of these updates that we're able to do. And I've just had to learn what size of a batch to use for certain vendors, just because you do too many at a time and you've actually messed up access instead of improving it. So I've had to learn which vendors I need to take a little more time and do in smaller batches as opposed to big ones as we continue going through this. But what I've really loved is that, we did have the foresight to do that pre-planning that luckily actually did get extended, where I was able to test every single resource, and we have that baseline. And we are so excited to say that this has not only improved our relationship with people across campus and the University System of Georgia, as far as that communication about all of these things, but our users really have, our access has skyrocketed for them off campus as a result of OpenAthens. And that has been a huge win for us. I mean, now it's close to 90% of our resources are now available through SSO completely off campus, and they were not available at the end of 2019. That was not the case. And so it has drastically improved access. We literally just had a meeting, Wendy, myself, and the other member of our systems team, to see where we stood. And we are close to 50,000 bibliographic electronic resource records that have completely been Athenized and are working. We tried to calculate to the best of our ability what part still remains, and we believe it's close to 75,000. And that sounds like a lot, but Wendy and I were sitting here thinking, is that everything? And we won't really know unless we continue to, we'll cast a little net with a query, we'll update some. And like you saw in the screenshot, it's sort of a tug and pull to see what remains. And we'll just keep going and piecemealing that process. I'm going to leave you with some tips. I'm not going to read this slide, but please feel free to get into this conference page before you log out. We will upload the slides, and you'll be able to save and look at more detail at some of the screenshots, including these tips that Wendy and I have put together that are what we would recommend if you are in any part in this process, and the things that we've learned that we wanted to share with you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Russell to wrap up.
Thank you. Just a few quick things here as we get to the end of our presentation. And Rachel, you can go ahead and move forward. Just a quick look at how it's going for Galileo. To date, all of our USG, TCSG, MPALs, which is our private academics, and GPALs and Pines libraries are using OpenAthens for authentication, which is great. We have a couple of small outliers in the GPALs realm. We're working on getting to K-12, our 9 Pines public libraries, and that remaining handful of private academics, and that's all going well. It's smoother sailing of late. We've been at this for a while, but there are always challenges. Vendors, we point out with Oxford, vendors are constantly acquiring each other and changing their landscape and changing their technical landscape, or changing their access platform, or updating their access platform in a way that breaks authentication. So we're constantly working to stay out in front of that. Support staff are still adjusting to SSO, but they're doing better here a few years in. And OpenAthens, obviously, while powerful, it has some limitations, and we learn to work against those. It also has some very powerful tools that we can use. And we're also adapting to the complexity of the SSO environment. It's a little bit more work for us at times while we're getting this set up here and working through it at the bleeding edge. But at the same time, I think it will be a really nice way of future-proofing it as IP access, I think, is going to begin fading as a means to access content And we're going to be moving in different directions in lots of different areas of library automation. Go ahead, Rachel. And I just wanted to close out by saying we're here to help. If you have any issues or problems, if you're an existing OpenAthens implementee, you can always contact us via the Galileo support link, and we're happy to help. We generally try to respond to things within 24 hours whenever possible. And if you have questions about implementation or the bigger picture, you're welcome to email me directly. If you're in one of those groups that we haven't implemented for yet and you're interested in learning a little bit more about what's going on, you're always welcome to reach out to me.